I sat at my kitchen table, holding the phone long after the lawyer's voice had gone quiet and the dial tone hummed its flat song. And I thought about how secrets have weight, like stones in your pockets pulling you down or holding you steady, depending on how you carry them. $4 million, he said, and the words felt foreign in my mouth when I whispered them to the empty room where Robert's coffee mug still sat, unwashed, on the counter, because some mornings I forget he's gone and make 2 cups out of habit. 3 days until Michael's wedding, and Jessica had been asking questions that felt sharp around the edges, the way a person pokes at a loose tooth to see if it still hurts. She would sit in my living room with her hands folded just so and ask about property taxes and estate planning and whether Robert had ever mentioned investing in land. And her voice carried something I couldn't name, but recognized the way you recognize rain before it falls. I remembered sitting in this same chair 30 years ago when Michael was small and had nightmares about monsters under his bed, and how I would tell him that sometimes the scary things aren't really there, but sometimes they are, and the trick is learning to tell the difference. Now I watched my grown son's fiancée through the kitchen window as she examined the garden like she was calculating square footage, and I wondered if I was seeing monsters where there weren't any, or if I was finally seeing clearly. The morning of the wedding, I woke before dawn and made coffee in the blue kettle that belonged to my mother and stood barefoot on the cold linoleum, thinking about how Robert would have loved this day and hated that he was missing it in equal measure. I could hear the caterers setting up in the backyard and the sound of folding chairs snapping open one by one like small metal birds finding their perches, and I thought about the papers locked in Robert's desk drawer that proved we owned 40 acres of what used to be farmland and was now worth more money than I had ever imagined having. I had found the deed 2 weeks after the funeral, when I was finally ready to go through his things, and the shock of it had left me sitting on the floor of his study, surrounded by bank statements and investment portfolios and insurance papers, while the afternoon light moved across the carpet in slow squares. Robert, the careful planner, Robert, the quiet provider, had bought the land 15 years ago and never said a word. And I understood that this was his way of loving us even after he was gone.
But Jessica didn't know about love that expresses itself in silence and preparation and the careful accumulation of safety. She knew about loss the way I knew about it now, suddenly and completely, and it had made her hungry for certainty in a way that felt dangerous to me. I watched her during the ceremony standing beside my son in her grandmother's dress, with her hair pinned up with pearl buttons and her smile bright as fresh paint, and I thought about how we are all trying to build walls against the things that scare us, and sometimes we use the wrong materials. The reception lasted until midnight, and I danced with Michael and listened to toasts about love and forever, and watched Jessica's mother cry into her champagne and felt the weight of my secret settling deeper into my bones. When everyone had gone home and the caterers had folded away their tables and chairs, I sat in my empty backyard and looked at the moon through the apple tree branches and wondered if keeping quiet was the same as lying, and decided it wasn't, not yet anyway. 3 days later, Jessica came to my door with a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as a estate planning specialist, and I knew without being told that my instincts had been right all along. They sat in my living room on the sofa, where Robert used to fall asleep watching baseball games, and talked about trusts and asset protection and the importance of organizing one's affairs, and Jessica's voice had the careful quality of someone who has practiced this conversation. "Does Michael know you're here?" I asked, and watched Jessica's face arrange itself into surprise and hurt and righteous indignation, and I thought about how we reveal ourselves, not in what we say, but in how we say it. Of course, she said, he's worried about you rattling around in this big house all alone. But her eyes moved to the framed photographs on the mantel, and I could see her calculating the value of silver frames and wondering what else might be hidden in plain sight. I made tea because that's what you do when you need time to think, and because the ritual of measuring leaves and waiting for water to boil gives your hands something to do while your mind works. The lawyer spread papers across my coffee table like he was dealing cards and explained how simple it would be to transfer assets and avoid probate and ensure that everything was properly documented, and I listened to his words and watched Jessica's hands twist in her lap and thought about how desperation looks different on different people. I appreciate your concern, I said finally, but I'm comfortable with my current arrangements. And I saw something flicker across Jessica's face, quick as a bird's shadow, and knew that she would be back. After they left, I stood at my kitchen sink washing the teacups and looking out at my garden where the tomatoes were ripening and the marigolds were blooming orange and gold. And I thought about how patience is sometimes the most radical act you can perform. She came back the next week and the week after that, always with a different excuse, always circling back to questions about property and investments and whether Robert had ever mentioned buying land. I would serve her coffee in my mother's good china and listen to her careful probing and answer with the kind of vague pleasantries that give nothing away, and I began to understand that this was a kind of war, fought with smiles and small talk and the strategic withholding of information. One afternoon, while she was supposedly helping me organize photo albums, I caught her photographing the return address on a letter from Robert's investment firm, and I felt something cold settle in my chest, like lake water in winter. "Are you looking for something specific?" I asked, and watched her face flush and her hands still, and her voice stumble over an explanation about wanting to make sure I wasn't missing any important correspondence, and I nodded and smiled and made mental notes about changing my mailing address. That night, I called Michael and asked him to come over alone. And when he arrived, I saw my son, really saw him for the first time since the wedding, and noticed how tired he looked, how thin, and I wondered what conversations were happening in his house when I wasn't there to witness them. "Has Jessica found any papers belonging to your father?" I asked, and watched confusion bloom across his face like ink in water. "What papers?" he said, and I knew then that whatever game Jessica was playing, she was playing it alone, and that my son was as much in the dark as I had been pretending to be. So I told him about the phone call and the lawyer and the land worth $4 million, and watched his world reshape itself around this new information, the way mine had reshaped itself around Robert's death, sudden and complete and irreversible. "She's been lying," he said, and his voice carried the particular pain of someone discovering that the person they trust most has been moving through their shared life with hidden motives and secret agendas. And I reached across the table and took his hand and felt how cold his fingers were despite the warm evening. We sat in my kitchen as the sun set behind the oak tree that Robert had planted the year Michael was born, and talked about trust and betrayal and the difference between protecting someone and deceiving them. And I thought about how the hardest conversations often happen in the softest voices. Michael looked like his father when he was thinking deeply, the same furrow between his eyebrows, the same way of pressing his lips together, and I felt Robert's presence in the room as surely as if he had pulled up a chair and joined us. "What do you want me to do?" Michael asked, and I realized that for the first time since Robert died, someone was asking me what I wanted instead of telling me what I needed, and the freedom of that question made me dizzy. "Nothing yet," I said, let me handle this, and I saw relief and worry fight for space on his face, and knew that I was asking him to trust me, the way I had once asked him to trust that the monsters under his bed weren't real. The next morning, Jessica arrived earlier than usual and found me in my garden pulling weeds from around the rose bushes that Robert had planted for our anniversary every year, 25 bushes for 25 years, and their roots were so deep now they could survive drought and flood and the casual neglect of an aging woman who sometimes forgot to water them. She was carrying coffee from the expensive shop downtown and wearing the kind of concerned expression that doesn't quite reach the eyes. "Margaret," she said, and her voice had the careful quality of someone approaching a nervous animal. "Michael told me you've been having some confusion about your finances." And I straightened up from the roses and looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a young woman who had learned that the world was not safe and had decided to make it safe by controlling it. And I felt something that might have been pity if it hadn't been mixed with anger. "I'm not confused," I said, and kept my voice level, and watched her recalibrate her approach the way a chess player adjusts strategy mid-game. "Of course not," she said quickly. "But you know how men are about discussing money. Michael's just worried that you might not know about all of Robert's investments." And there it was, the assumption that because I was a widow, I must also be helpless and ignorant and in need of rescue by younger, smarter people who understood the modern world. I invited her inside because that's what you do, and because I wanted to see how far she would push, and because sometimes the only way to end a game is to let the other player make their final move. We sat at my kitchen table, where I had eaten breakfast with Robert for 30 years, and where I had fed Michael cereal before school, and where I had signed mortgage papers and tax returns, and all the documents that make up a life. And I watched Jessica's eyes catalog the room like an appraiser making notes. "I know about the land," I said quietly, and watched her coffee cup freeze halfway to her lips, and her face go very still, the way people's faces go when they realize they've been caught. "I know you've been looking for it, and I know you brought that lawyer here, hoping I would sign papers transferring ownership, and I know Michael didn't send you." And each word felt like dropping stones into still water, watching the ripples spread and reshape the surface. She tried to explain, tried to make it about concern for my welfare and desire to help the family and worry about legal complications. But her voice had lost its careful modulation, and I could hear the desperation underneath like static on a radio, not quite tuned to the right frequency. She told me about her family's financial ruin, about losing their house when she was 16, about the fear that lived in her chest like a small, anxious animal, and I listened and understood, and still felt no obligation to solve her problems with my money. "I'm sorry that happened to you," I said when she finished and meant it, "but it doesn't give you the right to lie to my son, or manipulate me, or bring strangers to my house to pressure me into legal arrangements I don't want." And I watched her realize that her story, which had probably worked before, which had probably earned her sympathy and understanding, and maybe even money, wasn't gonna work on me. She cried, then real tears, not the careful tears of someone performing grief, but the messy, desperate tears of someone who has run out of options. And I sat across from her and waited for the storm to pass, and thought about how we all carry our wounds differently, and how some people's wounds make them gentle, and some people's wounds make them dangerous. When she could speak again, she asked me what I wanted, and I realized that this was the second time in 2 days someone had asked me that question, and both times it had felt like a gift. "I want honesty," I said. "I want you to stop treating me like an obstacle to overcome and start treating me like a person who might actually want to help if approached with respect instead of manipulation." And I watched something shift in her face, like light moving across water. We talked for hours that afternoon, really talked for the first time since I had known her, and I learned about her childhood and her fears and her dreams for the future, and she learned about my marriage and my grief and my determination to make my own decisions about my own life. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, and it wasn't friendship, but it was something like understanding, and that felt like a beginning. Michael came home that evening and found us both red-eyed and exhausted, and sitting at my kitchen table like negotiators after a long, difficult summit, and I saw him look between us trying to read the outcome in our faces. "We talked," Jessica said simply, and reached for his hand, and I saw her fingers tremble slightly, and knew that she was as uncertain about what came next as I was. Over the following weeks, we developed a new kind of relationship built on careful honesty and mutual respect, and the acknowledgement that we were both trying to protect the same person, even if our methods had been different. Jessica went to therapy like I suggested and started dealing with the trauma that had been driving her behavior, and slowly began to trust that security didn't have to be stolen. It could be earned and shared and given freely. I decided to sell half of the land and use the money to establish a fund for families who had lost their homes to financial fraud, the way Jessica's family had. And when I told her about it, she cried again, but this time the tears felt different, cleaner somehow. "You don't have to do that," she said. But I knew that I did have to do it, because Robert's gift wasn't just money. It was the freedom to choose how to use it, and I was choosing to turn our good fortune into other people's second chances. We worked together on the fund, Jessica and I, and discovered that we both had gifts to offer. Hers creative and mine practical, and slowly built something that neither of us could have built alone. Michael watched us with amazement and relief, and sometimes I caught him looking at us like he couldn't quite believe we had found our way from suspicion to partnership without destroying each other in the process. The first family we helped was a young couple who had lost their house to a predatory loan and were living in their car with two small children, and when we handed them the keys to a rental house that our fund was covering for 6 months, the woman cried and the man shook my hand and wouldn't let go. And Jessica and I looked at each other and knew that we had found the right use for Robert's secret gift. By the time my first grandchild was born 2 years later, Jessica and I had helped 43 families, and she had become the daughter I never had, and I had become the mother she needed, and Michael had learned that sometimes the best thing you can do is step back and let the women in your life figure out how to love each other. We named the baby Emma after Robert's mother, and when I held her for the first time, I thought about how love moves through generations, like light through water, changing shape but never diminishing. Sitting in my garden now, watching my grandchildren play among the roses that have grown wild and beautiful in the years since Robert planted them, I think about secrets and how some are meant to be kept and some are meant to be shared, and how the wisdom is in knowing the difference. The land that remains is worth more now than when Robert bought it, but its real value isn't in dollars. It's in the family that grew stronger because of it, and the families that found hope because we chose to share our abundance instead of hoarding it. Jessica still visits every week sometimes to work on fund business, sometimes just to sit in my kitchen and drink coffee and talk about everything and nothing. And I have learned that trust rebuilt is often stronger than trust that was never tested. We are both different women than we were that afternoon when she came to my door with her lawyer and her carefully rehearsed questions. And I think that difference is what Robert would have wanted his money to buy. Not security exactly, but the space for growth and change, and the possibility that even wounded people can learn to care for each other. Tonight I will water the roses and lock the doors and sit in Robert's chair reading until sleep comes, and tomorrow I will wake and make coffee in the blue kettle and continue the work of living deliberately and well, And when people ask me about the secret of happiness, I will tell them it has nothing to do with money and everything to do with choosing again and again to see the people around you clearly and love them anyway, because that is the only wealth that matters and the only inheritance worth leaving behind.